We are looking at an old illustration of a Dayak warrior from Borneo. And these were fierce indigenous warriors that left a very lasting impression, kind of an outsized footprint in the Western consciousness once they were encountered. Before we get any further into our subject, I want to point out that this video is a massive thank you gift, a humble one dedicated to Jonathan Carmack, who backed the creation of this book here. Oh my god, it's almost real. I could practically cry. It's taken so much work. But it's happening. My first weapons book since the original. Oh, wow. Anyway, Deadly Ingenuity, gonna be out soon. Thanks very much to Jonathan, who, by the way, wanted to thank Ryan M. Johnson, knife maker and weapon maker extraordinaire, who helped get word out about the book campaign. So thank you very much to both of them, and I'm going to get to show them, and anybody watching this, a pretty awesome antique weapon and tell you all about it. First though, let's get back to the culture from which it sprang. The phrase "wild man of Borneo" was once well known throughout the world. That really cemented in the collective consciousness because of popular entertainment. Quote, "The wild men of Borneo was a name given to the Dayak peoples of Borneo, later used to name several American circus freak show acts going back to the 1840s. Those acts, of course, had nothing to do with the actual culture. I mean, not even in terms of like a crude imitation. No, it was just the most exotic, name they could think of. The phrase most evocative of a, like savage indigenous warrior. And of course, that's, ironic in that all warriors are savage. They're killing each other. But one particular penchant probably led to this impression, and that was headhunting. I'm not actually going to show the heads in this warrior's hands, just in case YouTube has a problem with that. But as you can tell, based on the fact that this photograph exists, the practice existed and would pop up sporadically even in modern times. Here's a map of Borneo, and as you can see in the top left, it's in the South China Sea. Let's back up quite a bit. You'll see it circled in those red dots, and it's pretty close to the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Let's read a little bit from study.com while we look at this really stunning portrait of a Dayak warrior. Beginning around 3000 to 1000 BC, Austronesian people migrated from the Philippines and Asia and began inhabiting Borneo. The early Dayak people industrially produced numerous products from the lush forests of Borneo, including diamonds, gold, resins. I'm going to skip. The Dayak would trade these valuable commodities for Chinese porcelain, silk, and Javanese gongs. Since the 19th century, the Dayak have been influenced by colonizers and have fought to maintain their autonomy within the 20th and 21st centuries. Here's a traditional longhouse. Very large communal dwellings, could be like 150 feet long. Here's what the inside looks like. And it's important to know that Dayak is definitely an umbrella category for many native peoples within Borneo, over 200. And some are influenced by and intermingled with outsiders like people from Malaysia or Indonesia, and all of that is probably why they have such a wide-ranging arsenal with lots of different names, including different names for what is basically the same thing, and that includes the thing we're going to look at today. Not what you're about to see. I want to show you some of the variety I was just talking about, and boy, notice how each one of the ones we're about to scroll through are just amazing looking. But anyway, what we're going to look at is an authentic example of the classic Dayak, yes, headhunting sword, called a mandau. There is definitely a dearth of quality information about these out there, by the way. And when I say these, let's look at ours, the one we're going to check out today. For those of you not familiar with it, first a tiny little surprise, I'm showing it upside down. Here it is with the cutting edge down. And back to the dearth of information about these, it really is surprising given how fascinating these are, but let's go ahead and learn as much as we can about them. First of all, they have that clipped point that is kind of like a sayax. They always broaden out once they start moving away from the hilt, but the degree to which they do that varies. Notice our cutting edge here on this one is concave, but only slightly. That's typical, but it seems like they can be straight as well. And the spine side of the blade is always going to have that general, very elongated sayax type outline, but there can be serious variation there, including decoration like we're zooming in on here, and I'll back out and let you see the entire Mandau. So part of this is the regional and ethnic differences that we talked about. One culture's ethnicity's version of the Mandau is going to be slightly different than another's. But let's get back to ours, and we haven't talked about the handle yet, a very distinctive feature, as you can tell. Made of wood, bone, animal, or, at least in legend, human, and I'm willing to believe that considering the headhunting practice, horn or antler. I think those are maybe the more common, and almost always decorated with hair, as you saw, usually animal. And the actual grip is typically braided, as we saw, and that could be in different ways. Nice thick spine, as we saw there. And it feels great in hand, of a very practical weight/balance combination. Now, these things are described often as ceremonial swords, then they're often also described as like the sword of the Dayak. And like with many indigenous cultures trying to survive into modernity, souvenir versions started to be made. And if they're authentically old, but from that transitional period, like this one probably is, might be, then it's going to be really hard to say for sure. The scabbards are, as you can see with ours here, usually decorated as well. They're split wood, held together by different natural bindings, usually rattan. Only the side that's going to show when it's worn up against your hip is decorated, and the inner side that's just sitting on your body would be plain. Or plainer, and those regional differences that we talked about and ethnic differences could definitely play a part in this. You can see here where the outside is definitely more elaborate visually than the side I was just showing. What's been lost to time here is the accompanying smaller, almost scalpel-like knife. Kind of like the way those tiny little knives of undetermined purpose, as far as I know, traditionally accompany a cookery. And again, that could maybe not be a ubiquitous feature and something that was favored in some areas over others. These things go by many different names depending on the exact culture that produces them. The name Mandau, which is kind of the most common one, actually translates as double knife because of that much smaller blade, whose name, which I am not going to try to pronounce, translates as whittling knife. So it's a small utilitarian instrument. Traditional warfare on Borneo was no joke, as you might imagine. Poison blowguns were used, which if you notice here in this picture, they were a spear blowgun hybrid, which makes them pretty darn unique, and they are written about in the book Deadly Ingenuity, by the way. The poison was quite effective, and if you got hit anywhere on your body, that was pretty much the last thing you would ever know, I guess, besides the sensation of your body shutting down from the poison's effects. For the up-close work, it was swords and shields. Speaking of those shields, here you can see one, and they are pretty remarkable in and of themselves. A lot of symbolism built into the weapons of the Dayak. That includes, by the way, on some Mandau, there are symbols that relate to leeches. And if that seems odd, we are told that that's because leeches were flexible, kind of agile in a way, if you think about it. And, of course, they draw blood. And the Dayak saw these as admirable traits. A leech takes your blood as a Dayak warrior takes your head, and like other headhunting cultures, such as the Azmat, it was believed that these were, important magical or spiritual items. A person's head contained their soul. And possessing your enemies, or one of your enemies, or as seen here in a longhouse, many, imparted some power, some spiritual protection. You might have to go acquire an enemy's head to prove your worthiness to the father of the woman you wanted to marry. They were used for other rituals and important purposes. Here's a quote from a book called Mutual Aid Among Savages. Moreover, Dayak headhunting takes quite another aspect when we learn that the supposed headhunter is not actuated at all by personal passion. He acts under what he considers as a moral obligation towards his tribe. Just as the European judge who, in obedience to the same, evidently wrong principle of blood for blood, hands over the condemned murderer to the hangman. And that is why the Dayaks, apart from the murders they commit when actuated by their conception of justice, are depicted by all those who know them as a most sympathetic people. And here's an old quotation about them from that same book. As regards morality, I am bound to assign to the Dayaks a high place in the scale of civilization. Robberies and theft are entirely unknown among them. They are also very truthful. By the way, you might notice the skulls in the upper portion of this image. Those are a lot less gruesome than the ones I censored earlier. What else about the sword itself? I didn't do a good job of showing this in the images that I took of the one I held, but, and I know this is not an image of a blade here, also, regardless, one other real distinctive feature is that the blades are not symmetrical from a cross-section standpoint. I don't know if that's a universal feature, but it does exist, and furthermore, and this is really rare, the blades can be somewhat warped, so they're actually not, rod straight, and the idea there is that facilitated the swing for removing somebody's head from their shoulders. I feel a little suspicious about that one, but that's what the lore states. The blade would be made of a combination of a soft and hard iron, the harder portion being sandwiched in between the softer ones. And as I'm sure you know, even if you don't know anything about these swords, the idea there is to have that center section provide the rigidity that you want for a very sharp cutting surface with more yielding material on the outside to give the sword some flexibility and resilience. The Mandao shares some similarities with the Keris or Kris, one of the most famous ethnographic weapons from anywhere, but which happens to be from this same part of the world. The Mandao is also thought to be, this spiritually powerful item. At least I found some literature and comments about that. But the construction technique that I just mentioned, they share that. And the fact that, like the Keris, meteorite ore could be used in the construction of the blade. So these could be very high-quality blades. They can resist the effects of time very well and hold a great edge. And these were mainly for swinging, not thrusting, despite the sharp points that we've seen sometimes, and that's why they could often have a rounded tip, like in this example. And these originated as brush-clearing machete-style blades, and so that makes sense. But if you had a nice, sharp, triangular point, like the one we just saw on this example here, I imagine you would thrust with it in combat if the opportunity presented itself. Speaking of the more utilitarian aspect, an ambang, A-M-B-A-N-G, is a humbler Mandao. It wouldn't be made from ore from a meteorite, for instance. And they were also more likely to be made for export, more of a souvenir, and maybe that's the kind I'm holding here. I don't know. It goes back to those transitional time period comments I made earlier. But I would say a legitimate native-made and old sword of the Mandao type. So I hope you enjoyed seeing it and learning about it and the warriors who wielded them. Thanks.